35,000 feet, the cabin was quiet, in the way only airplanes can, engine noise humming steadily, tray tables down, a few passengers already asleep, others scrolling on their phones, unaware that anything out of the ordinary could possibly happen. From the outside, this flight looked exactly like thousands of others crossing the sky that day. No turbulence, no bad weather warnings, no urgent announcements. And yet within minutes, something would change so suddenly that even the flight crew would struggle to fully grasp what they were facing. A sound most passengers had never heard before cut through the calm. Instruments in the cockpit began flashing warnings that didn't usually appear together, and a decision had to be made faster than anyone on board realized. What followed would later be described in official reports as a precautionary landing. But that phrase barely scratches the surface of what was unfolding in real time. Because the truth is, the most dangerous part of this emergency wasn't the landing itself, it was the confusion. The incomplete information and the split-second judgment calls happening long before anyone in the cabin understood they were in trouble. This is the story of an emergency landing that almost no one saw coming. Not because it was minor, but because of how quietly it began. Today, we're going to break down exactly what happened on this flight. Step by step, using verified timelines, pilot procedures, and first-hand accounts to separate fact from assumption. We'll look at how a routine journey turned into a high-stakes situation in the cockpit, why the passengers were told so little while so much was happening, and how early reports missed a critical detail that only emerged later. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this landing was far more serious than the headline suggested, how close the situation truly came to becoming something much worse, and why incidents like this remind us that modern aviation isn't just about technology, it's about human decisions made under extreme pressure. It's often in total silence. The flight began like thousands of others that day, quiet and predictable. Passengers boarded without urgency, storing bags overhead, exchanging polite smiles, settling into routines they barely thought about anymore. The aircraft itself showed no signs of trouble. Maintenance checks had been completed. Weather reports were favorable, and air traffic control cleared the route without hesitation. In the cockpit, the pilots reviewed their flight plan, discussed fuel efficiency, and joked lightly as the plane climbed smoothly into cruising altitude. Everything about the journey suggested it would be forgettable. For most people on board, this flight was simply a means to an end, commute through the sky. No one noticed the small details that would later matter. A minor sensor fluctuation, a checklist item mentally noted and dismissed, a reading that stayed just within acceptable limits. These details didn't trigger alarms or concern, but they quietly planted the seeds of what was coming. Aviation emergencies rarely begin with chaos. They begin with normality. That's what made this flight so dangerous. Nothing felt wrong until it suddenly did. And by the time anyone realized something was off, the window for easy solutions was already closing. The first signs of trouble didn't arrive as panic-inducing alarms or dramatic movements of the aircraft. Instead, they appeared as subtle inconsistencies. A system message flickered briefly, then disappeared. Gauge hesitated before stabilizing. In the cockpit, the pilots exchanged glances, not alarmed, but attentive. Experience teaches them that problems don't always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they whisper. The cabin remained calm. Drinks were being served, seatbelt signs stayed off, and passengers continued watching movies or drifting into sleep. Meanwhile, the pilots began quietly cross-checking data, comparing instruments, and running mental scenarios. Was this a sensor? Error? A temporary fluctuation? Or something more serious beginning to unfold? They requested additional information from air traffic control, careful not to escalate unnecessarily. What made this moment critical was uncertainty. The aircraft wasn't clearly failing, but it wasn't clearly fine either. In aviation, uncertainty is one of the most dangerous conditions of all. Every minute spent evaluating carried risk, yet acting too early could also create problems. The crew walked a tightrope between caution and commitment, knowing that once they declared an emergency, there would be no turning back. The situation escalated rapidly when multiple systems began presenting conflicting information. Individually, none of the alerts would have demanded an emergency landing. Together, they painted a picture the pilots couldn't ignore. Warning tones filled the cockpit, checklists came out, and communication shifted from casual to precise and clipped. Training took over. Each pilot knew their role without discussion. One flew the aircraft, the other managed systems and communication. Time compressed. What felt like seconds were packed with calculations, procedures, and judgment calls. Passengers still didn't know anything was wrong, but the cockpit had become a high-pressure environment where mistakes could cascade quickly. The crew faced a defining question: continue flying and risk escalation, or divert immediately and deal with the consequences on the ground? There was no perfect choice, only the safest available one. When the captain finally made the call to prepare for an emergency landing, it wasn't driven by fear, but by probability. The risk of staying airborne was quietly becoming unacceptable. Choosing where to land was its own challenge. The closest airport wasn't necessarily the safest. The safest wasn't necessarily reachable under the circumstances. Air traffic. Control cleared surrounding airspace as the pilots evaluated runway lengths, weather conditions, emergency response capabilities, and fuel status. Every factor mattered. Meanwhile, the cabin crew was informed briefly and professionally. They were told just enough to prepare without causing panic. Training once again took over. Faces remained calm, voices steady, even as their hearts raced. The announcement to passengers was carefully worded, avoiding the word emergency while still instructing them to prepare for landing. This balance was intentional. Panic helps no one. As the aircraft descended, the pilots worked non-stop, adjusting speed, altitude, and configuration, managing a plane that no longer behaved exactly as expected. The margin for error narrowed with every 1,000 feet lost. This wasn't a dramatic dive toward the ground. It was a controlled, deliberate descent shaped by skill, experience, and the knowledge that dozens or hundreds of lives depended on every movement. Inside the cabin, tension replaced comfort. Passengers sensed that something wasn't right, even if they didn't know what. The descent felt steeper than usual. The engines sounded different. Flight attendants moved with purpose, checking seatbelts, securing loose items, making eye contact that silently reassured without explaining. Some passengers prayed. Others clutched armrests or reached for loved ones. Children sensed fear without understanding it. What made this moment especially unsettling was the lack of information. The human mind fills silence with worst-case scenarios, yet that same silence prevented chaos. The cabin remained orderly, even as emotions surged beneath the surface. Few people realized how close the situation truly was to crossing a line beyond recovery. The aircraft was still flyable, still responsive, but only because every procedure was executed precisely. This phase of the flight was a test not just of machinery, but of human discipline under stress. The landing itself happened faster than many expected. Emergency vehicles lined the runway, lights flashing against the tarmac. The pilots guided the aircraft down with focus so intense it excluded everything else. The touchdown was firm but controlled. The moment the wheels met the ground, relief flooded the cockpit, but the situation wasn't over yet. The aircraft slowed, systems were shut down in sequence, and emergency crews approached cautiously. Passengers waited, holding their breath, until the plane came to a complete stop. Only then did applause break out, mixed with tears and shaky laughter. Evacuation wasn't required, a decision that further confused passengers who still didn't understand what had nearly happened. On the ground, officials began crafting statements. Words like precautionary and technical issue were chosen carefully. What they didn't say mattered as much as what they did. In the hours and days that followed, reports began circulating. News headlines downplayed the severity. Social media filled in gaps with speculation. Some called it routine. Others exaggerated it into disaster narrowly avoided. The truth sat quietly in investigation reports and data logs. The incident wasn't caused by a single failure, but by a chain of small issues that aligned at exactly the wrong time. The critical factor, the one most people missed, was how quickly those issues compounded. Had the crew delayed their decision, Even slightly, the outcome could have been very different. This wasn't luck, it was disciplined judgment. Aviation safety is built on moments like this, where nothing dramatic happens because professionals act before drama becomes inevitable. What this emergency landing teaches us is simple but unsettling. The most dangerous situations aren't always loud or obvious. Sometimes they unfold calmly, behind closed cockpit doors, while passengers sip drinks and watch movies. This flight didn't end in tragedy precisely because of decisions made when the danger was still invisible to most people on board. The landing nobody saw coming wasn't a failure of technology, was a reminder of why training, experience, and quiet competence matter so much in the sky. And the next time you hear about an uneventful emergency landing, remember this story. Because sometimes the real crisis is over, long before the wheels ever touch the ground. When this aircraft finally rolled to a stop and the cabin doors opened, most passengers walked away believing they had experienced nothing more than a brief delay and an unusual landing. There were no dramatic evacuations, no visible damage, no immediate sense of how close the situation had come to becoming something far worse. That is exactly why this story matters. In aviation, success often looks like nothing happening at all. The real work happens quietly, behind the cockpit door, in moments where decisions are made before panic ever has a chance to begin. This emergency landing wasn't about fear or failure. It was about awareness, discipline, and choosing the safest path while there was still time to choose. What truly happened on this flight reminds us that danger doesn't always announce itself with chaos. Sometimes it arrives as uncertainty, as small warnings that only trained eyes know how to read. The passengers never saw the calculations, the checklists, or the pressure inside the cockpit, but they benefited from every one of those moments. So the next time you hear about an emergency landing that wasn't a big deal, remember that. The absence of disaster is often the result of extraordinary decisions made in silence. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this: the flights that end safely are often the ones that came closest to going very wrong without anyone ever knowing.